Hi everyone, my name is Lauren Gemino. Today I will be discussing my systematic review in this presentation that focuses on autism spectrum disorders and their impact on nutritional inadequacies. This is for the class Nutrition 5600 at Eastern Illinois University. Here is a quick overview of my presentation. I will begin with the introduction. In this section, we will go over some important terms to know for the presentation. We will then discuss the purpose of this presentation. Then I will go over the methods or steps I took to find my articles. I will discuss my inclusion and exclusion criteria, my Prisma diagram, and finally a chart that lays it all out in this section. We will then synthesize the results from these articles and discuss why these results occurred. And finally, the conclusion discussing the strengths and weaknesses of my research as well as future implications. We will now begin with the introduction. Autism spectrum disorder, or autism, is one of the 5 disorders under the category of pervasive developmental disorders. And these are neurological disorders where children have a difficult time talking, playing with others, and relating to others. Autism spectrum disorder, which will be seen as ASD for the remainder of the presentation, are diagnosed in terms of behavioral presentation, while typically developing children, which will be seen as TD for the remainder of the presentation, are those children that are not receiving special education services. Autism is categorized by a variety of symptoms, such as an inability to engage in social interaction, as well as having a loss of verbal and nonverbal communication. Individuals with autism tend to have restrictive, repetitive, and stereotyped patterns of behavior and interest. In order for an autism diagnosis to be considered, signs of atypical development must be present before the age of 3. The first problem that is often presented in children is a delay of speech and language. According to the CDC, autism is seen in about 1 in every 59 children, and it is 4 times more likely to occur in boys than girls. The etiology of this disorder is unknown, but it occurs in all racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic groups. There are no medical tests to diagnose autism, but there are a variety of different assessments that can be used to help with the diagnosis. I have selected 3 common ones that I often saw used during my research in order to give you all a better understanding when I discuss my primary articles. The first one is the Autism Diagnostic Interview Revised, or ADIR. With this assessment, an interview of the child's parents or caregivers is conducted by a trained researcher or psychologist. The interview focuses on the developmental history of the child, and it relies on the memory of the people closest to them. This type of assessment is most accurate when it is assessing children 4 years old and up. There are a total of 93 questions during the interview, and the questions are designed to identify behavioral issues related to 3 areas: communication and language skills, social interaction issues, and repetitive and obsessive behaviors. In order to isolate behaviors that could give a false positive, the interviewer takes a case study that covers medical history and prior diagnoses, general behaviors, developmental milestone dates, history of speech and language development, and destructive or aggressive behaviors. The next assessment tool is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or DSM-5. This is a standard reference used by healthcare providers to diagnose mental and behavioral conditions like autism. There are a total of 5 diagnostic criteria for autism with the assessment. The first is persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts currently or by history. The second is restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities currently or by history by 2 of their 4 items listed. The third is symptoms must be present in the early developmental period. The fourth is symptoms cause clinically significant impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of current functioning. The final one is disturbances. Disturbances are not explained better by intellectual disability or global developmental delay. There are 3 levels of severity with this assessment. Level 1 requiring support, Level 2 requiring substantial support, and Level 3 requiring very substantial support. The last assessment is the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, or ADOS. This is a semi-structured assessment of communication, social interaction, and play for individuals suspected of having autism or other pervasive developmental disorders. There are 4 different modules used to assess the individual, and each one is appropriate for children and adults of differing developmental and language levels. During this assessment, the examiner selects the model most appropriate for the individual and observes them during standardized activities to see the occurrence or non-occurrence of behaviors identified as important to the autism diagnosis. Module 1 is typically selected for young children, Module 2 for individuals with some phrase speech but not verbally fluent, Module 3 for verbally fluent children that play with age-appropriate toys, and Module 4 for verbally fluent adolescents and adults. Many children with autism experience problem behaviors that could be caused by their inability to express what they need or want, or from their inability to understand and respond to normal social cues. Approximately 1 in 4 children with autism have disruptive behaviors, and parents with children with autism often report challenges with daily activities, behaviors, and communication, with many of these parents expressing concerns related to mealtimes. Statistically, this seems to be supported, with 46 to 89% of children with autism reportedly having co-occurring feeding problems, compared to the 25% of typically developing children. Feeding problems are defined as a range of problematic meal behaviors that repeatedly occur during mealtimes. These problems can be food selectivity, otherwise known as picky eating, and oral or motor difficulties. Examples of food selectivity are selectivity by type or texture, and examples of oral motor difficulties may include dysphagia or difficulty chewing. There is some research that suggests these feeding problems are associated with the behavioral problems experienced within this population. For example, children with autism often experience sensory hypersensitivity, which is causing the individual to reject foods due to their texture, temperature, or other characteristics. The individual may also experience an inability to participate in mealtimes, to model habits of their family, or to effectively communicate what they want or need. These mealtime problems are caused by the individual's inability to engage in social interaction, which is often seen among individuals with autism. The repetitive and ritualistic behaviors of autism may also cause rigid mealtime routines, causing a food jag, which is when a person eats a very small group of food for each meal. These problems could lead to poor nutrition and problems with developmental growth. The reason I wanted to focus on children with autism for my research is because I was a camp counselor for children with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and ever since then, I have been interested in learning more about this population and the common problems related to nutrition they may encounter. The situation that sparked this topic was when one of my campers with autism dropped their meal on the ground. The camp had replacement meals on hand, and they were even able to give the camper the exact Lunchable that was dropped. However, they refused to eat it because it was not their original Lunchable. Also, while at work, I always noticed that the individuals with autism had the same meal every day, and they would not eat if it was something different. I also noticed these children often had disruptive behaviors during lunch, causing them to either eat much slower than the other campers or not eat at all. Knowing I was studying dietetics, their parents would also come up to me during pickup and drop-off and discuss with me the concern they had for their child's health, since they would get in these food jags, which is why I wanted to look into this topic more. Autism is not typically seen as a nutritional disorder, despite there being research about potential deficiencies often associated with them. And this is why I decided to use this topic for my research. The purpose of this presentation is to summarize current scientific research that assesses the impact of an autism diagnosis on nutrition inadequacies in children with autism spectrum disorders. I will now discuss the methods I took to locate my research articles. For my research, I focused on using the electronic database EBSCOhost because it was the one most familiar to me since I used this in undergrad. Within EBSCOhost, I selected 12 other databases to search from: Academic Search Complete, CNOL, Communication and Mass Media Complete, Consumer Health Complete, Health Source Consumer Edition, Health Source Nursing and Academic Edition, Hospitality and Tourism Complete, Humanities International Complete, Professional Development Collection, Psych Articles, Psych Info, and finally, Social Sciences Abstracts. I used two main search terms: autism and feeding problems, and food selectivity in autism and nutrition. I set the date for 2006 just to give me a little bit of leeway in case I could find good articles that were in that time frame. EBSCO also has an option to click peer reviewed, so all articles available from my research were from peer-reviewed journals. Here are the list of my inclusion and exclusion criteria that the articles had to meet. Each article had to be peer-reviewed and had to be from the last 10 years. However, one of my articles is from 2008 because it was a decent article and it still was relatively recent. There also needed to be children with autism as subjects in the article. They needed human subjects and they needed to mention some type of impact on nutrition. This could have been providing actual numbers or just simply mentioning their diet. For the exclusion criteria, all systematic and literature reviews were excluded. Articles that focus on adults with autism were also excluded because I wanted to focus on children. And articles that did not have any children with autism and was focusing on typically developing children were also excluded because the focus was on autism. But it did not necessarily matter the severity of their autism. Articles published before 2010 were excluded, except for the one, and articles that did not mention nutritional impact were also excluded. We will now move on to my PRISMA diagrams. PRISMA is an evidence-based set of requirements that is used when reporting in systematic reviews and meta-analysis. I had two different search terms, so I created two separate PRISMA diagrams for each set to make it a little bit easier to follow. My search terms are also a bit different than my topic because I was originally assessing feeding problems in children with autism and their impact on nutrition. The first set of terms I used were autism and feeding problems. With this search, I had 181 articles available to me. However, I could not find enough articles that were related to my specific topic at the time, so I also had to use the reference list of multiple articles within this search in order to locate some more. I located approximately 57 articles through reference lists, but I did have to estimate this number a little bit based off the records I had because I did lose track while I was bouncing around between reference lists, so I don't have an exact number. After duplications, I had 136 articles to screen, and I excluded 77 from this list using my exclusion criteria based on their abstracts and titles. This left a total of 59 articles to assess the full text for eligibility. From here, I had some more exclusions. I lost 15 articles due to their date, 3 articles because I could not get access to them, and the library could not access them for me either. 16 articles for no mention of nutritional inadequacies, 12 articles for not including food selectivity, and finally, 7 articles were excluded because they were reviews. This left me with 0 qualitative studies and 6 quantitative studies from the search terms. After coming up short with the first search terms, I decided to try the other terms, food selectivity and autism and nutrition. This time I used food selectivity instead of feeding problems, since many studies often used food selectivity, and it was the most common feeding problem seen among individuals with autism based off my research. I also added nutrition to ensure I was getting some more articles that discussed this topic. With this research, I had 106 articles available to me. Again, I had to use the reference list of multiple articles to locate some more, and I had to do another approximate of this number just because of the back and forth between different reference lists. I used about 15 extra sources from the reference list of certain articles during this search. After duplications, I had 61 articles to screen, and 39 articles were excluded from this list because they did not meet my exclusion criteria based on their titles and abstracts. This left me with 22 full articles to assess for eligibility. Then after reviewing these, I excluded more articles to reach my 10 primary articles. 8 articles were excluded for the date, 6 articles were excluded because they did not mention nutrition, 4 articles were excluded because they did not discuss feeding problems or food selectivity, and 4 articles were excluded because they were reviews. This left me with 0 qualitative articles and 4 quantitative articles. The total number of articles between both search terms and the reference list was 359 articles. I screened a total of 197 articles through the abstracts and titles, and I screened 81 full-text articles for eligibility. I narrowed all of this down to get to my 10 primary articles. After completing my research, I realized that I was not able to find the articles that looked at what my original question was. Many articles mentioned nutritional inadequacies and feeding problems, but they did not necessarily relate the two together like I was originally trying to do. Because of this, I ended up tweaking my question a little to look at how the autism diagnosis itself affects nutritional inadequacies. The next 2 slides will show a breakdown of my 10 primary articles. These results made it easier to organize the data and to be able to easily compare each. From each article, I extracted the author, journal name, year it was published, the purpose of the article, the age and number of participants, how they were diagnosed, if there were exclusion criteria for participants, the methods the researchers took to find their data, if education was provided, and finally, the results of each article. I decided to pull the information about the diagnosis of autism to ensure that each participant had clinical proof of this diagnosis instead of just a parent or guardian verbalizing it. And this was to gain a more accurate result of my topic. Here I have the first 5 of my articles. As you can see, each article has a different age range they are focusing on with a total range of 2 to 18 years among these 5 articles. Since my focus was children, I wanted the participants to be 18 and under, but I did not necessarily care about a specific range. Each article also used a different diagnosis criteria. Some of these were the ones I discussed in the introduction, like Article 3, 4, and 5. However, Article 2 used the Indian scale for assessment of autism to confirm the diagnosis. This scale assesses the severity of autism in Indian children and complements a standard diagnostic assessment schedule. For 3 of these 5 articles, the participants were recruited from different autism centers, community programs, and hospitals, and Articles 2 and 5 used convenient samples to find participants. It is important to note that Article 4 was a preliminary study, which is the reason for a small participant number. The results of these articles were mainly conducted from food frequency questionnaires, 3-day food records, and 24-hour diet recalls that were filled out by parents. Article 5 used a different type of questionnaire called an Eat questionnaire. This is a parent report questionnaire that measures the extent of eating problems and patterns in autism. It includes 3 parts: demographic and developmental information, 44 items related to types of feeding problems rated on a 6-point Likert scale, and a food table that rates items on a 5-point Likert scale. I felt it was important to note the articles that had control of typically developing children, and those articles are bolded in the methods section. And those are Articles 2, 3, 4, and 5. I also thought it was important to note if there was education about portion sizes or how to fill out a 3-day food record to consider adequacy of the results each article had. One article did have a 2008 date, as I mentioned before, but this was the only one in my group of 10. I also made sure to note in all 10 of my articles when feeding problems were identified and if they were found to impact the overall results of nutritional inadequacies. Here are my next 5 articles. Again, I extracted the author, journal name, year of publication, the purpose of the article, the age and number of participants, how they were diagnosed, if there were exclusion criteria for participants, the methods they took to find their data, if education was provided, and finally, the results of each article. I again bolded the methods of the articles that contained a control group, which were Articles 7, 8, 9, and 10. Similarly to the first 5 articles, there is again a different range of ages among each article, with the overall range of these 5 being 2 to 17 years old. It is important to note that Article 6 was a pilot study, which is why the number of participants is so low. As it was with the first 5 articles, these 5 used different diagnostic criteria. Articles 7, 8, 9, and 10 used diagnostic criteria I discussed previously, but with Articles 8, 9, and 10, they were different versions. Article 7 also used 2 additional assessments. The Vinland Adaptive Behavior Skills characterized adaptive skills, and the Differential Abilities Scale assessed cognitive ability. Again, 4 of the 5 articles recruited the participants from autism centers, schools, and community listings. Article 8 was an observational study that was part of a larger case control study, so it did not mention how exactly they found their subjects, just that they were part of a bigger study. These results were again identified through a 3-day food records and food frequency questionnaires that were again filled out by parents. However, I did point out that Article 7 was the only one that allowed the child to help fill out the form themselves if they were able to do so. It is important to note that with all 10 of these articles, the majority of the children with autism were males, with one of the studies having a completely male group of participants, since this diagnosis is more common in males than it is females. We are now going to go into a little bit more depth about the article I sent to the class via email, which was Article 10 on my chart. I decided to send this article to the class because I felt it gave a good overall idea of my research topic. For this study, 40 children with autism, 35 boys and 5 girls, ranging from the age of 6 to 9 years old, were recruited from a school in Spain. They compared the results to a group of 113 typically developing children, 64 boys and 50 girls of the same age from a different school in Spain. In order to be included, the children could not be taking dietary supplements or be on dietary restrictions, such as the gluten casein-free diet. They could not be diagnosed with a genetic syndrome known to be associated with autism, such as Fragile X syndrome, and they could not be taking any drugs or medications that could modify their food intake or requirements. This criteria applied for both groups of participants. Their intake was monitored by parents using a 3-day food record, with one of these days needing to be a non-working day. I found this to be the case in every 3-day food record throughout my research because it gave the researchers an opportunity to see how the individual's diet on the weekend differed from their diet on school days. The computer program DIAL was used to obtain the nutritional data from the participants because it contained a lot of information about the foods frequently eaten in Spain. I found the overall results of this particular article interesting because it identified that both groups needed improvement on their diets. Children with autism had a higher risk of not meeting the recommendations for calcium, vitamin C, and iron compared to typically developing children. However, both groups had inadequate intake of fiber, and the typically developing children had improper intakes of vitamin E, while the children with autism actually were over on their intake with this vitamin. I found these results to be interesting because they mentioned how the diet of the typically developing children also needs to be improved. This could suggest the nutrient inadequacies of children in autism is just due to age, but typically developing children also experience some feeding problems similar to those of children with autism, and these results could possibly be correlated to those as well. The overall results of these 10 studies indicated that children with autism commonly have nutrient inadequacies and are at an increased risk of developing these. More specifically, 7 of the 10 articles indicated that the calcium was commonly deficient. 5 articles indicated that zinc was commonly deficient. 4 articles for iron. 4 articles for fiber. 3 articles indicating vitamin D was commonly deficient. 3 articles for vitamin C, and another 3 articles that identified certain B vitamins, such as B6, B12, and thiamine being deficient. Some of these deficiencies were related to certain age groups within the study, and it was common to see the older groups with more deficiencies. A couple of the articles did not specifically look at nutrient deficiencies, but instead they focused more on the types of foods and the types of foods they were missing from their diet. One article identified children with autism eating more energy-dense foods and snacks while eating fewer vegetables than typically developing children. And another article identified children with autism eating less fruits and vegetables compared to the typically developing children, and they did not eat foods from flour, dairy, legumes, and casseroles, which could support their reasoning for some of these micronutrient deficiencies. A secondary result of these articles was that children with autism have more feeding problems than their typically developing counterparts, and food selectivity was the most common problem, potentially putting the children with autism at risk for these nutrient deficiencies, as suggested by 4 out of the 10 articles. Here is an overall breakdown of my research. Between the 10 articles, there were a total of 900 children with autism spectrum disorder that participated, and 823 of these participants completed the research and all the requirements associated with them. There were only 2 studies out of the 10 that indicated not having received the required information from each of the participants for the study. For the typically developed children, a total of 361 children participated, and 359 completed the research. These participation numbers are not very large for either group, because for the children with autism, 7 of the 10 articles had less than 60 children recruited for the study, and 2 of the studies were preliminary research studies. For the typically developing children, only 7 articles had a control group, with one of these studies comparing the results of the recruited children with autism to typically developing children with similar demographics using a national database, which did not require the need for recruitment for typically developing children. The age range of participants across each article was 2 to 18 years, with many focusing on the 3 to 13-year age group. Since autism is so prevalent and occurs everywhere around the world, I felt it was important to find research from different countries in order to get a better perspective and understanding. So for this reason, I used articles from Turkey, India, United States, Israel, Japan, and Spain. So what do my findings mean? As a reminder, the purpose of my presentation was to assess the impact of autism diagnosis on nutritional inadequacies in children with autism spectrum disorder. Among all 10 of my research articles, it was suggested that children with autism are at a greater risk of consuming inadequate amounts of certain nutrients such as calcium, fiber, iron, and vitamin D. And they also eat less fruits and vegetables compared to typically developing children of the same age group. It could be possible that the feeding problems commonly experienced by this population are the cause of the nutritional inadequacies. This was seen as a secondary finding in a small portion of my articles. These articles indicated that feeding problems associated with autism may cause these inadequacies. I also identified 2 review articles and 1 secondary article that identified similar results. More specifically, from these 3 articles, it was suggested that individuals with autism with food selectivity were selective against certain types of food, such as meat, milk, and fruits and vegetables. And this selectivity was causing deficiencies in the vitamins and minerals from these foods. These children were also had greater food refusals due to sensory sensitivities, as well as had a limited food repertoire, leading to decreased intakes of fruits and vegetables, which was again causing those deficiencies in nutrients. I think this is important to point out because feeding problems in this population are common and they are often associated with other behavioral and sensory problems they are experiencing. However, feeding problems are often overlooked, which could lead to the nutrient inadequacies and interrupting normal growth and development. So in conclusion of my systematic review, the results of my 10 primary articles suggest that children with autism are at an increased risk for nutrient deficiencies, and these deficiencies could be related to behavioral and sensory problems associated with the diagnosis. Here is a brief summary of my findings. The purpose of my presentation was to summarize current scientific research that assesses the impact of an autism diagnosis on nutrition inadequacies in children with autism spectrum disorder. I felt this was important because I have worked with children with autism and have seen firsthand the feeding problems and have heard from parents the concerns they have for their child's health and nutrition. To locate my articles, I used the database EBSCOhost through the Eastern Illinois Library, plus the reference list of certain articles that was found during my search. I used a Prisma diagram as well as just normal charts to help keep myself organized. The results of my research indicated that children with autism are at a greater risk for developing nutrient inadequacies, and it was concluded that my research suggested that children with autism are at increased risk for deficiencies, and they could be related to behavioral and sensory problems associated with the diagnosis, causing the feeding problems. But more research is still needed on this subject. Here is a list of the limitations and strengths of my research. With the limitations, not all of my articles were from 2010 or later. I did have one article that was from 2008, as I had mentioned before, because I felt that it was a strong research and it was still relatively recent. Another limitation is that there was not a specific age I focused on, making it a little bit harder to compare results, since I had participants that were 2 years old and participants that were 18 years old in the mix, which made it a little bit difficult to see what age group was at a greater risk for nutritional problems. Another limitation is that every study did not have a control group, which made it harder to compare the results. And 2 of the studies were pilot studies or preliminary studies, causing there to be a limited number of participants. The final limitation is that the majority of the subjects with autism were males, which didn't really allow for an accurate representation of this population. The first strengths of my research is that the multiple studies indicated similar results, suggesting these results are strong. Each article identified the nutritional inadequacies in autism, with some focusing on specific nutrients and some on specific foods. The articles were even identifying similar vitamins and minerals that were deficient, such as calcium. There was also plenty of research on this topic after tweaking my question to focusing on autism in general leading to these nutritional deficiencies. Another strength was that 4 of my 10 articles were within the last 5 years, with one of them being from 2019. I felt this was a strength because I was able to find current research that was up to date on the topic. My final strength is that I used articles from 5 different countries. This allowed for a better representation of this population, since this is seen worldwide. For the implications for future research, I would suggest that more research needs to specifically look at the correlation of eating problems in autism and how those specifically affect nutrient deficiencies. Many of the articles looked at the nutrient deficiencies for children with autism, as well as the prevalence and types of feeding problems. They suggested the possibility of these feeding problems causing the deficiencies. However, there was very few articles that identified feeding problems causing these deficiencies specifically. Another implication is to have more research on the specific types of food children with autism selectively consume. There are some articles that I found that identified specific types of foods these children commonly do not eat, but it would be helpful to know so we can better understand why these deficiencies are occurring and what foods need to be supplemented in order to reverse these deficiencies. The last implication is to have more research with a larger number of participants. Between my 10 sources, I had less than 1,000 participants, and in order to get a more accurate representation, there needs to be a greater number of participants. Now we will talk about the implications for future professionals. It is important for future professionals to screen patients with autism for nutritional deficiencies, especially if they are at risk of having feeding problems due to severe behavioral and sensory problems. It is important for professionals to know what the deficiencies are in order to provide the proper foods and supplements to improve these and allow for proper growth and development. The next implication for future professionals is to have a multidisciplinary team in order to improve sensory problems that could allow for increased intake of food as well as an increase in a variety of foods. For the dietitian, this could mean encouraging consumption of foods with different textures and consistencies that is normally rejected due to sensory issues. The last implication for future professionals is to keep all treatment individualized to the person. Each person with autism has different behavioral and sensory issues, as well as different nutritional needs. It is important to have an understanding to the general commonalities among this population, but no two patients will look the exact same. In order to improve these deficiencies, it is important to consider the individual themselves and devise a plan for them specifically. Here is the list of my reference articles. Thank you for listening to my presentation. If anyone has any questions, please reach out to me. Have a nice day.